And now we're joined by our guest, Dr. Jacek Raubo, Director, Defense 24 Analysis Unit. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, sir.
Thank you for the invitation.
Jacek, we just spoke to a pretty high-level, former high-level NATO official, had an interesting discussion about all things NATO, celebrating. I wanted to dig at this question a little bit. We'll combine a bit of history, a bit of the future. He was very positive about NATO and its future. But looking at it now, looking at these difficult times, especially with the war raging in Ukraine, what is your main sense out of this special day today, 75? What does NATO mean for you? What does it mean for Poland and the region?
Actually, I think this day is very symbolic for the whole transatlantic community because this achievement of NATO construction from 1949 till now is a very optimistic sign for the next generations that they can build their security environment on the pillars which are offered by the effective constellation of NATO institutions from the political and military side. Of course, right now we need to talk more about challenges and also threats with which we are dealing with right now. So we cannot abandon the discussion about the future goals of NATO. But I think celebrations are offering us a very optimistic history that we can overthrow some threats from our neighbors, and also we can build effective bridges with new members. I'm talking also about Polish integration with NATO from 1999, but also we see a very large contribution from the new two NATO members, Sweden and Finland. And I think it's a very, not only optimistic, it's a very pragmatic sign that we need to have this kind of a military and political pillar in our construction of our architecture, security architecture in Europe, but also much more wider in the transatlantic relations. And also we need to offer this stabilization to other states in the future.
You mentioned Poland within the NATO structure, and this is something that I want to touch upon this very moment. Since joining the NATO family, how do you think Poland changed, and what did we learn from this very alliance?
Generally, this is the revolution for Polish security because after integration with NATO, we are inside one of the most sophisticated forms of military activity, from, of course, Article 5 missions and also to some other forms of actions outside even transatlantic zone, like in Afghanistan. So we are dealing, I'm not talking about the past, this is a very constant revolution in our minds. We are dealing with a lot of forms of modernization inside our armed forces, inside our doctrines, and also with very bilateral and multilateral cooperation with various partners like United States, France, Germany, and other members of NATO. And I think we need to accept that this is not the end of our way, our very large path to modernization. We need to do it because Article 3 from the NATO treaty is giving us a strong message that, first of all, we need to invest in our own armed forces to achieve some goals dedicated to deterrence and defense issues. But on the other hand, we can, based on a very strict cooperation with our partners, like United States, like United Kingdom, but also France, Germany, Portugal, and other members like the newest one from Sweden and Finland. So from the various sides, we see large differences between this Polish security and defense field before 1999 and a situation after joining NATO as a whole structure.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of celebration marking different years, 75 years. Also this year, as we mentioned, 25 years of Poland in the alliance. This also reminds me a very interesting point when it comes to my question. I had an interview with the head of main editor of Onet, Mr. Jacek, and he said that at some point, this idea of joining NATO, this was really an effort that was done not just at a high government level. This is, cultural level, different people lobbying for this cause because the Polish nation as a whole really wanted this to happen. Now that was obviously the first days of freedom, first days of Poland again being independent, and NATO was more than just a military alliance, was also a symbol, I think. But a case in point, if we look at the Cold War, the 50s, the 60s, 70s, there was more of, I think, a mindset issue that people understood that there is a Cold War going on, there's a threat from Russia. Now we're having, in a very short period of time, a lot of, let's say, threats on our doorstep. A lot of spending is continuing. NATO is back on page one. But are its citizens really on that same page? I mean, we know policy is there, but what can we do for citizens to have that mindset again, that we know that this is something that must be part of our lives? As the Nordics understand this, Poland understands this, but not so much if we go over to Germany or potentially further away, Spain or even Canada.
I suppose the answer for your question is always divided for two layers. First, dedicated to the military, security, and political elites in various NATO members. And I think it's much more easier right now to achieve success due to this task, because even if you are far away from the eastern flank, you understand Russian threat, and you understand also other threats which are coming from, for instance, some technological race which is threatening us inside transatlantic zone. But on the other hand, I think the second layer, strictly connected with citizens, it's much more difficult. It's much more sophisticated. And the answer for this task is education. Even in Poland, we can compare how we educate our people before integration with NATO during the 1999 and just a few years after that. There was a large number of books. There was a large number of discussions. We had this kind of a debates to get some lessons learned about the history of NATO toward our own first steps inside NATO. And right now, I think we are dealing with some smaller number of the same fields of studies in our society. And that's why, for instance, pro-Russian activists can spread some disinformation about NATO, about our alliance, about effectiveness of this alliance. And we need to come back to not only the levels of tanks and howitzers during the Cold War. We need to come back to the first step of education, because the next step after this education, how NATO is working, is a much better prepared society and also nations for achieving some goals for military and non-military pillars of NATO. For instance, why I'm very important as a citizen for NATO, because NATO is the pillar of our security, and would like to see effective collective security to have this space for education, for economy, grow, for some other aspects of my life. And we need to come back to the origins of NATO, to the virtues and values of NATO. And we need to spread that in our societies. And I agree with you that it might be much more difficult to come back to this origins of education inside, I don't know, Western, far West NATO members compared to the Eastern flank members. But we cannot be sure that also in the Polish society we see very effective forms of education about NATO. We need to work on that, and I'm very optimistic in this task, because people are searching for some sources about NATO. They see, for instance, your program, and you are talking about 75th anniversary of NATO creation, and this is a very important step for enlarging the number of knowledge in inside our society, because the knowledge is also rapidly changing and transferring NATO community, because we need to have a synergy between the elites of the political scene in various states and also their own citizens, because NATO is the construction based on the democracies, and that's why everybody needs to have this kind of knowledge about NATO.
So since we're on the subject of the 75th birthday, let's compare NATO to a family. In every family, we happen to have some sometimes annoying relatives, let's say. We know that there are some countries within the alliance that want to have their cake and eat it. How do you think, especially now, during what's happening in Europe geopolitically, in Europe and in the world, how do we bring them back into the fold?
I suppose your question is connected with, for instance, the Turkish posture toward Russia or Hungarian policy toward Russia. But on the other hand, we need to accept that there is something which is behind. And inside this NATO connections dedicated to military plans, dedicated to standardization of our own armed forces, I think we are overthrowing these types of threats against our unity. And we need to be much more patient in that, because I think one of the biggest achievements.
But I have to interrupt you, Jacek. Sorry, I have to interrupt you because I think we hear this many times. We have to be more patient. But I think on every single level, Hungary, for instance, has always been the first to raise its hand to block something, and then the final one to finally put it down. And I'm just thinking about, if we're looking about streamlining defense, I know there's unity and we need consensus, but are there any, in your mind, just speculation, can we potentially, change anything in the way how things are done? Is there any way, let's say, a policy to amend this? Because we always have the same candidates. I mean, I think with NATO and Turkey, yes, there's a case to be made that they have more clout, but there are certain players like Hungary that are just we know that they're going to raise their hand and say, wait, no, we don't support this, and we want everything before we actually say no. I mean, it doesn't sound like a great family.
I was trying to be more diplomatic, but let's have an answer to this question.
And it's a very great question, but we need to have a kind of a division between two main topics. First is a military assistance to Ukraine, and the second topic is our own activities inside NATO. And look at the second thing. We accept new plans toward Eastern flank security. This is the big achievement, one of the biggest one after the Cold War. And it is supported by Turkey, it's supported by Hungary and other members. We enlarge NATO to Sweden and Finland, even with some questions about the position of Hungary in this field against Sweden. So we are achieving a lot of goals inside NATO. But of course, I agree, we are struggling with the questions how to build effective unity toward the support of Ukrainian defensive war against Russian aggression. And here, I think it is much wider topic than NATO, because NATO is a defensive alliance. We have tools to support our own defensive measures. On the other hand, I think we need to use more diplomatic tools and more, and for instance, more European Union tools to build some pressure or to build better bridges with governments where we see a kind of opposition against our own vision, how we would like to support Ukrainians.
Indeed, but I think there's a lot to take stock and celebrate and mark with positive emotions. I think 75 years, over 1 billion citizens, and 32 member states. Thank you so much. That was Jacek Raubo. Really appreciate your insight on this special day.
Thank you for the invitation. Stronger together in NATO.